do know a little bit about what I'm talking about. Jimmy Austin, I'm a native, well, I'll start saying a native of Sheffield. I've been in Sheffield all but 1 year of my life. My parents moved to Sheffield when I was a year old. So I was raised in the city and educated in the city and became an educator in the city. Spent my entire career here teaching in Sheffield. When I retired, I was a counselor at the high school. And so I got on the Historic Sheffield Commission. First meeting, I sat down and the lady that had been doing the tours had decided not to do them anymore. And that was the first year that Alabama had decided April will be walking tour month. And since Sheffield had an established walking tour, the Historic Commission wanted to continue that. My first meeting was in February, and one of my former students' mother was on the commission, and she said, well, we got a teacher right here, he can do that. So I was drafted to be a tour leader. My entire career was teaching world history, not Sheffield history. And even growing up in Sheffield, as you know, wherever you grow up, you don't know a whole lot about everything that went on around you. I just sort of took it for granted growing up in Sheffield, but I didn't know as much as I needed to know to be a tour leader. And so I'd start studying and getting some information about my hometown. And so I've acquired a little bit over the last few. This is the 6th year that I've done this. But I'm not going to do a lot of ancient history. This is about historic Sheffield, basically walking the residential area of North Montgomery Avenue. Next week, the tour goes down through the town. And basically next week, the tour talks about what's not there anymore. We're fortunate that on this tour today, you're going to see 13 houses that date to the 1800s. We've been fortunate that we've only lost 3 houses that were built in the 1800s. Lost all 3 to fire, as you can imagine. Let me just give you a little bit of background about why people came to Sheffield, because I'm going to hold off on that till we get to a specific residence. But after the Civil War, of course, the South was in a rebuilding situation, and there were a group of investors looking to build steel mills in this part of the state. There was an abundance of iron ore, abundance of coal, and this particular spot, being close to the river, seemed to be ideal. Plus, it was completely different from the neighboring cities. Tuscumbia to the south, Florence to the north were both agricultural-based cities. Florence had agricultural land just outside the town to the west, to the north, to the east. Tuscumbia really was surrounded by agricultural land, which included this place right in here. There were farmers doing agricultural work right where we're standing. And so the people that came here wanted to do something completely different from the town to the north and the town to the south, and make this city a prosperous industrial city. They foresaw something similar to what was taking place in Birmingham, hoping to make another Atlanta, Savannah, Charleston, Memphis, whatever. And so that's why we see up this street, particularly here, this street, but just off of each side as well, a lot of very elaborate Victorian type homes. And so let me talk about the City Hall first, because they wanted to make a statement with the original City Hall. And in 1888, well, let me just state, 1885, you'll hear that date a lot. 1885 was when Sheffield was established. And by 1888, they had started the foundation for this building. And you're also going to hear 1890 as being a major economic setback nationwide. And so by 1890, what was taking place right here on this site came to a screeching halt. And they stopped the foundation of City Hall, and where the basement was is where the jail was back in 1888 and 1889 and 1890, and they just stopped at the jail. And this site set, I don't want to say vacant because there were jailers there, but from 1890 until 1923, it was sort of just in limbo, if you will. And finally, by 1923, they decided, let's finish this place. And so they went back to what was here, knocked it down, and started all over, and redesigned it. And so this is the city hall that resulted, and the clock still works, as far as I know. It's not on time right now, but it's still working. Or it was. I don't know if it's even working right now or not. But anyway, City Hall was an established place by early 1920s. Now, before we go walking, let me just point out this house across the street behind me that you're looking at. This house dates to 1891. And I'll just tell you, this was Sheffield's first millionaire that lived in this house. He was a very industrious, prosperous investor by the name of J.B. Messina. From the best we can determine, Mr. Messina, and I'm not sure if that's how they pronounce it in Italy, but that's where he came from. He was an immigrant to America from Italy, and he came and established himself in this young and growing and prosperous city, and he invested heavily in property. He was on the bank board. He rented property. He bought and built houses in the industry. He was in the insurance business, and he desired to be in the brewery business. He went down on the riverbank and built a large building that he envisioned as being the next Anheuser-Busch, if you will, or something to that effect. And built a really modern building in all aspects of brewery and ale producing product. And by this time it was in the 20s, and nationally talk of prohibition was gaining momentum. And he had already had everything in place, and he had brought in a crew from St. Louis, I believe is where they came from, with a brewmaster. And they were afraid that if they established and invested themselves here, and then the prohibition did come about, that everything that they had put into would be lost. And so the whole crew packed up and left Mr. Messina with a vacant brewery. But being the industrious guy he decided it won't take a whole lot of modification just to change this over to ice production. That was the millionaire moment. He became a millionaire selling ice, because as you can imagine, in the 20s, everybody had an ice box. And the tale is that there were horse-drawn wagons up and down these streets in all neighboring areas, because it was the largest ice house in North Alabama. I mean, it was huge, and I went there as a kid. They had blocks of ice as big as that car come out, and then they had a machine that would crunch out ice and put it in a bag, and boy, you talking about homemade ice cream. I mean, it was wonderful for homemade ice cream. And by that time, they had changed the wagons into trucks, and they were riding around through town, not for ice boxes, but they were going to businesses, rentals, used ice. They had some sort of ice-cooled air conditioning in rentals that they bought truckloads of ice daily. And so anyway, Mr. Messina ended up making millions of dollars selling ice, among all the other things that he was into. But that's the first house. And by the way, I've got a handout to give you that shows almost every address, not every single, but most of the houses on the street, but I do not intend to discuss. see it's called Old Grace Event Center because this was originally called Grace Episcopal Church. And I'm gonna say about 5 or 6 years ago now, the people that purchased this building totally went in and gutted the place and rebuilt it from the inside out with a steel structure to make sure it didn't fall down. The house next door was really afraid that that north wall was going to fall on the house. I mean, you could stand out here in the street and see it leaning. And they've pretty much pulled it back up straight now. But this building right here dates to 1903. Some of them do have these historic markers. I was on the tourism committee that pushed these markers in the last 2 or 3 years. And every homeowner, literally in the county, in Carver County, if you had a house that was 100 years old or more from 2020 back, if your house was 100 years old or older, then you qualified to put a marker in your front yard. The owner has to pay for the marker, and it's their marker. But the Tourism Bureau created and produced those things. Well, anyway, you see this is the Keller Bishop house. You can see the date, 1887, right after the city of Sheffield was founded. Sam Keller had the house built for his family. And he was a banker. He was the president of Sheffield National Bank. And they had just moved in 1887 and was loving life in the up and growing city, and here comes 1890 and there's that financial depression. And things in Sheffield come to pretty much a screeching halt because money's tight. He's afraid there's going to be a run on his bank. And to keep his bank afloat, he put his house up as collateral to save his bank. And unfortunately, that didn't work because the depression was so deep. I keep using the word depression. It wasn't like the 1929 crash, but it was a financial depression or slowdown so bad that businesses just halted in Sheffield, and the bank failed. And you can imagine the house was lost. And so you see the next name, Bishop, on there. When the house was lost, it was sold at public auction. You know how that works, over on the courthouse steps, you know. Mr. Bishop came from Georgia. He paid $2,125 and bought this house, and it was 3 years old.
Oh my goodness.
And the Bishop family lived in this house and their descendants for the next 100 years.
Wow,
Just in the past 20 years or so, their descendants sold the house to the folks that put it back the way it looked back in 1887. It's a great house, unfortunately, Mr. Keller, and we don't know what happened to him. He lost his house and he lost his bank and he left the area. And I don't know that he was any relation to the Kellers in Tuscumbia. People have asked me that, and I've not established that. Now, he could have been, but I just don't know that. I really wish it did have a historic marker, and I will tell you this, I made sure that every house on the street that qualified got an application. It was mailed to them. I sent a list to the Tourism Bureau and said, these houses do qualify, please notify the owners. And we did get some responses, and we did sell some markers. This house is very historic. In that, on your list, you see this is the Blair house. And this was Dr. Blair that moved here. Dr. Blair came, he had been to school at Vanderbilt, and he heard about the up and coming town, Sheffield, and he decided, well, this might be a good place to establish a practice. And so Dr. Blair came, and he did. He was a general doctor, but he did some surgery. He did a lot of research. And I will tell you this, his practice was very prosperous, so much so that he was an investor. He was an astute businessman. He made lots of money. He was doing very well, and I'll throw this out, but this name is not really on the street. But those of us that have grown up in Sheffield know the Blake name. One time there was a Blake Elementary School that my wife even taught at, but that school is gone. But the Blake family, with 3 or 4 generations, were very um, entwined in the city of Sheffield. Dr. Blair invited Dr. W.H. Blake to come to Sheffield. He went to school at Vanderbilt with Dr. Blake, and he and Dr. Blake had a practice in Sheffield. He was doing so well that the city, who was reeling from this slowdown in the early 1900s, I think I want to say the election of 1904 was coming up, and some city movers and shakers came. Dr. Blair, would you please consider running for mayor? And Dr. Blair said, yeah, I'll do that. And the city was in immense debt. Dr. Blair was elected because he was a very popular doctor and very successful, you know. He was put in the mayor's position 1905, took office, and he was I've got it in my notes, but I won't say he was the 8th mayor of Sheffield or something to that effect. Very first few. He said, I'm going to serve one term. I don't want to be a multi-term mayor. I'm going to do one term, and if I'm successful, I'm successful. If I'm not, I'm not. And as I said, the city owed tons of money. They had borrowed money like everybody else to keep the city going. Within 4 years, the city went from the red to the black, from in debt to surplus and money in the bank. And they begged him, please stay on, please stay on. One term, that's all I promise. And so there was a big outpouring, you know. I've got copies from the newspaper back then that the city council wrote out this big, long tribute to him that they crying and hugging and all that stuff at his last meeting, you know. And he walked away. And the city was on stable financial ground. Inside the house, things weren't so good. I just have to tell you that. The things weren't so good inside the doors of this house. Within, I won't say 8 to 10 years of him being the mayor, he and his wife were on really shaky ground. Some say that they were about to be divorced. Some say she had already separated from him. Some say that she had moved out or he was moving out, or, you know, that's rumor stuff. We don't have anything written down that says this is what took place. One day I hate to have to refer to notes, y'all, but it's the first time I've done this in 6 months, you know. One day in 1919, hold on a minute. One day in 1915, I'm going to say, he walked down the street. 17, I'm sorry. His wife and daughter had gone to the theater down here. I don't know what kind of theater there was in 1917. I don't know if it wasn't talkies. I don't know if it was a movie theater in 1917. It may have been a production of a theater. But it was on Montgomery Avenue because the Ritz was not yet in place. Okay. And he walked down the street knowing that his wife was in the theater, and he was standing out waiting on his wife and daughter when they walked out. And when she walked out, he pulled out a gun and shot her. I'd say things weren't so good at home, right? Things weren't good. She hit the ground. Everybody thought she was dead. I mean, she hit the ground. She didn't move. He turned around. He didn't check on her. He just turned around, started walking back home. He walked 2 blocks, stopped on the corner, put the gun to his head, and shot himself and died instantly on the street corner. She survived. He had shot her from a distance, and it went through her arm, elbow, into her side, and that's what took her to the ground. He was 55 years old, and the city was just, you can imagine, they were appalled at what had taken place. I mean, this was a guy that they had revered, a very popular mayor who had definitely helped the city, and personal situation just overcame his judgment, and he killed himself thinking he had killed his wife, but she survived, and she's lived a while longer. I just found this out the last couple of weeks. She is buried next to him, but at a distance. There, he had a plot. He had a plot up in Oakwood Cemetery. They're not buried side by side, but they are buried in the same plot. I think after he died and after he had shot her, she said, "Okay, I'll be buried by him, but I don't want to be buried right next to him." So it's not a Victorian house, as you can see, but the reason we stop here and mention this is because it does have kind of a neat story. This is the Burns family that lived here, and Mr. Burns had 2 daughters, and one was named Becky or Rebecca, and one was named Earlene. Now, if you've been in Sheffield as long as I have, everybody knows Earlene Burns. Not a lot of people know Becky Burns, but really she was, well, they were both renowned for different reasons. Becky married Sam Phillips. Now, I don't know if you know the name Sam Phillips or not, but there's a street over in Florence off of Veterans Drive called Sam Phillips Boulevard or Sam Phillips Avenue or something. WQLT and WFIX and all those stations over there came from his founding. Oh, also he discovered Elvis Presley. That's the kicker right there. He happened to find Elvis singing in a little place over in Memphis and decided, wow, this guy may be worth looking into. And you know the rest of the story, and he was. And so Sam Phillips and Becky Burns were a couple in Memphis for a long, long time. Elvis, you know, did pretty well. And he bought a bunches of Cadillacs, and it seemed like Earlene always ended up with his cast-off Cadillacs somehow or another. She lived over on Hatch Boulevard, and she'd have in the 50s and the early 60s all these big long Cadillacs. So when she got tired of one, she'd just park it, and he'd send her another one. And at any one time, there may be 3 or 4 old Cadillacs sitting in her house. She was an eccentric lady. She played the piano. In fact, she was a dancer. She taught my wife dancing lessons and piano lessons. My wife just lived a few blocks from her when she was a kid, when my wife was a kid. Earlene was on TV. Earlene in Storyland. Y'all ever heard of that? She was on TV, Earlene in Storyland on Channel 15 over here in Florence, about 6 o'clock on Saturday morning. She had a 30-minute show, and she had puppets, and she danced, and she sang. And as I was growing up, and I would be invited as a high school kid to go to the Kiwanis Club or the Rotary Club or whatever, there's Earlene. She's playing the piano for the civic clubs there. She played piano for all kind of people and all kind of different situations and being on TV. And as I said, she was just a little different, you know. She talked to her puppets and she talked to her dolls, and she had a good time on TV, and everybody knew Earlene Burns, Earlene in Storyland, and her connection to Elvis Presley from the Burns family. Mr. Sheffield, by the way, because he rode in a wagon with the auctioneer in the 1883 land sale. He was a young student at the time, law student. Became a prominent judge and lawyer here in Sheffield. But Judge Joe Nathan. His father was the first postmaster, so it was a very prominent family. He had this house built for him. And he lived here for a few years until he moved to a different house, and I'll show you the house he moved to shortly. Yes, ma'am?
Is it originally duplex or have they done that for rental property purposes?
Initially, now that, and I have a terrible picture. This is what the house looked like initially.
How did it get to this whole thing?
Well,
Oh,
that's where I'm getting ready to tell you.
Onto it, evidently.
After Judge, and I don't know exactly when this happened, but after Judge Nathan moved away, when the Turner family was living here, from what I understand, one of those storms came through. Now, where the tree was, I have no earthly idea, but a tree fell on this house, and it lost its Victorian perspective. As you can see, there's not much Victorian aspect left. But in fact, in the 30s, city fathers came through and told people, y'all need to update your houses, get rid of that Victorian stuff and get in the modern world.
Oh, no.
Luckily, most of them didn't do that, but some of them unfortunately did. This one just took a hit from a storm. But Judge Nathan left, the Turner family moved in, and this is and that's been the end of my story for the most part, until just last fall, when Ms. Dyer found out who the Turner family was. Sam Turner from Cherokee worked for the railroad, and he moved to Sheffield to be closer to his work. It's hard for me to believe this. There were 13 people living in this house with the Turner family. He had bunches of kids, and their relatives also lived with them. And this is what I understood, because on the trolley tour, I had about 6 or 7 of their family members riding with me, and they told me this story, that because there were 13 people in the house and one bathroom, the rule was, when you come out the bathroom, leave the door open. Because when the door was left open, that meant somebody could run down there and get to the bathroom, because there were 13 people in there. Well, anyway.
It's a pretty big house, though.
Oh, yeah. It is a big house, but in 1925 and 1930, it was one bathroom.
Right.
And so Mr. Turner had a daughter who married a Carter. And in Sheffield, those of us that have been here for a long time know the Carter name. In fact, one of my neighbors where I live, her daddy was George Carter. He was a long-time supporter of the Sheffield Bulldogs. You could go to ball games in the 50s. He played up there in the 30s and 40s. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, he was sitting with his back against the wall by the press box. And, "Go you Dogs!" And everybody, the whole stadium could hear him. I mean, he was a huge supporter of Sheffield Athletics. His brother was Sam Carter, who owned Carter Oil over here on 2nd Street, which is still in the family. And that's who was riding the trolley with me and told me about the one bathroom deal. Now, when the Turner family moved out, mid-40s or so, a lady bought the property and she turned it into apartments. And it's been apartments since the 1940s. So it's kind of lost a little of the original look, but there is a lot of history in this house. Dates to 1887, and here's the fact: it was the first brick house in Sheffield. Not the first house now, but the first brick house to be built in Sheffield. We will show you on the tour up in the next few blocks the first house built on Montgomery Avenue. But actually the first house in Sheffield, unfortunately, is vacant and has been vacant for years, and it's over just off of 2nd Street. It's called a Barner House, who owned a huge amount of property and a big plantation owner. The house needs to be saved, you know. But anyway, that's a whole other story. This guy was named Major George Keyes, and George Keyes was a lawyer, but he didn't like law. And so he just gave up his law career and became a paper writer. And he was a newspaper man back down in South Alabama, later in Montgomery, found his way to Florence, and began to hear rumors that there might be a town across the river. And so the story that I found was that he made a visit to the lovely side of the river, which is where we stand right now, by the way. And he thought, golly, this would be a great place for a town. And it was just talk. I mean, this is like 1880, let's say. Remember, the date was 1885 that we were looking for, but this is in the 1880s. Major Keys called on one of his good friends from Montgomery, Civil War veteran by the name of Captain Alfred Moses, who had come out of the war, got into business, into banking. He and his brother had become very prosperous. Major Keys said, Captain, you need to come up here and look at this place on this bluff in Sheffield. Oh, no, my bad, not Sheffield, in North Alabama. I think it's worth looking at. It's thanks to Major Keys that Captain Moses came, and Captain Moses and his brother met with some other investors from Montgomery, who met with other investors from Savannah, Atlanta, Memphis, Charleston, and they formed the Sheffield Land, Iron, and Coal Company. And that's where Sheffield got its founding, thanks to this man's foresight to invite his friend to come. As a newspaper guy, he didn't have the wherewithal, if you know what I mean. He didn't have the money, but he knew who to talk to. And because of that, Major Keys says, I was the first citizen of Sheffield. And he went on to be a very prominent man in the city of Sheffield. And by the way, he built this house. This is the way it looked in 1887, but the story is he built it around a log cabin. And so if at some point in time the people decide to do any renovation in the house, they're going to uncover a log cabin if the story is true. And that's been rumored over the years that there's a log cabin inside that. Then Hoyt Greer bought the house after Major Keys had passed away. Hoyt Greer was a druggist. He later became a mayor. And by the way, you're going to find a lot of mayors that lived on this street. This is just the first one I'll mention, but the next house and the next house and the next house, all going to be homes to mayors. But this is a very significant house. Most people don't give Major Keys enough recognition for his foresight in getting Sheffield established. These two houses, but they're not the same people and they're not related. You're going to hear the name Cook for this house as well as for this house. And actually, it's connected to this house, which is kind of a strange occurrence. But anyway, here goes, so I'll just try to go slow and keep y'all abreast of what's taking place. The guy that built this house, and this house dates to, what was the date on it? This house was 1895. The guy's name was Stockton Cook. And Stockton Cook was a partner with a man by the name of Mr. McTeer. And you'll hear Mr. McTeer's name twice on this tour. After this mention, there's two more times to mention him on two different houses. But the reason I mention him is because this, in 1895, when they established their business, it was a huge business. It was called a Cotton Compress Incorporated. Now just stop and think, cotton compress, you know what that is? They took huge bales of hay and had this giant press that would compress a bale of cotton to make it smaller to fit on the boat that went up the river, And so Stockton Cook and his family established themselves in this house. Stockton Cook. Let me see if he was the guy. Yeah, I was trying to remember. His wife's name was Kate Rulak, and that's the house across the street. And so we'll talk about how this house was connected to them when we get back over there, because it's going to be a roundabout deal. But I just wanted to make sure you got this cook connected with that house, because this house is going to be a cook that's not connected to this at all. It's a different cook altogether. But anyway, this house, you'll notice on the wall up there it says the Painted Lady. Can y'all see that sign up there above the address? This house was built to replicate houses of the day in San Francisco that had the Painted Lady moniker attached to them because of the intricate detail. Now, if you'd have driven down this street, I'm guessing 8 years ago, this house was painted purple. I don't have any gold on, but Sheffield's colors are purple and gold. And this house was, I mean, it jumped off the street at you. It was purple with gold trim. And so when it went up for sale, the people that bought it, guess what? They covered up that purple and gold. All right, now this house does have the name Cook associated with it, but I've got to back up before we even get to the Cook name. Originally, this house and the little house over there was not there. Okay, that was just a vacant lot or a garden lot maybe. But this house initially was built by a 30-year-old man by the name of Judson Chambers, who had heard about the big movement in the city of Sheffield down south, because he came out of Indiana. And he was kind of an unusual combination. He was a furniture seller, furniture business, and an undertaker. So I guess they'd sell you a casket if you died, I don't know. But from what I understand, he had a very prosperous business, and he did so well that he built this house here in, what year was it? 1890. And so I'm not sure exactly how long he lived in Sheffield, because his business was doing very well. They had a big double storefront down on Montgomery Avenue in the business section, but 8 years he lived here. And in 1898, he sold his house to Charles and Medora Robinson. And the Robinsons lived here for a long time. Even after their passing, their families lived here. And here comes that other Cook. Their daughter married a man by the name of Sam Cook, or Samuel Cook. And he was a prominent businessman. He was one of those mayors that I was talking about. He was a 3 or 4 term mayor, and they were doing very well. His wife's name was what was his wife's name? Caroline. And so Sam and Caroline Cook were living in the house. And her sister's name was Lila Cook, and she married a man by the name of Hogue, and they lived in the house because it became vacant when Sam and Caroline went right over there and built a brand new house in 1923. And they moved out of this house and moved over there for a while. And so they left the house to their sister. Okay, so y'all with me still?
Yeah.
Cook and Hogue. And so it was known as the Cook house and the Hogue house. And in 1938, Sam Cook decided, I'm gonna sell this house. I want to move back over here. And so Lila had to find her a place to live because she and the sister didn't want to live together. And so they lived here till 1947 when Sam died. And Caroline continued to live in the house by herself or with her daughter, I think, until, let me see, I had to write all this stuff down, until 1962. So we've gone from 1898, when her parents were here. She's lived here till 1962, and then she sells the house to a family by the name of Kimbrough. The Kimbroughs came in and completely turned the house into apartments, kind of like what happened up there at Judge Nathan's house. Made it an apartment house. And that was from the 60s until the 80s, late 80s. And she moved out. And let me see, 1988. And for the next 20 years, this house stood vacant.
Oh my, what a waste.
It stood vacant. This is what it looked like, probably in 1970, maybe. A little bit different than it does now. It stood vacant for so long that the man who lived in this house over here then, who was not, the judge, Mayor Cook that had lived here, moved out. A new family moved in, and the man that lived over there was by the name of Beard, and he became a mayor. And then he moved out, and my boss, the superintendent of education, bought that house over there. And every morning he'd wake up and go to the kitchen and he'd look across the street and see this decrepit looking house. And I'm gonna tell you, 20 years ago, I wouldn't have long gone up there and just rested my arm on that house. I've been afraid it'd go through the wall or the house would fall down. I mean, it was in horrible shape. It looked terrible right here in the midst of historic area. And we've got a vacant house that looks horrible. The city put it on their hit list that either the owner fix it or take it down. And so the superintendent talked to his brother who lived in, I think he lived in Montgomery or somewhere in South Alabama, and they decided they'd buy the house and put it back the way it used to be. And so they started doing some research on the house, and the brother went to the archive place in Montgomery and talked about the house, and they said, oh yeah, y'all need to save that house. It's got a beautiful Victorian stairway in it. And the brother said, no, there is no stairway evident in this house. It's been subdivided into apartments. And I'm sure that stairway, if it was there, was been done away with. And the man down there said, no, we've done research on this house. It's there. Well, Dr. Tomberlin, the superintendent, and his brother was trying to raise money to redo the house. And then up and all of a sudden, my superintendent decides to leave Sheffield and take another job somewhere else. And the house just still kept sitting there and sitting there and sitting there. And it was for sale with the superintendent trying to sell the house. Now, he's not living here anymore, but he's trying to sell the house. And in that 20-year frame from 1988, what's that, 20 years is 08, 19 years, 07 lady by the name of Norma Trapp. She and her husband bought the house, and they turned it into what it is now.
You have an idea of what they paid
They
for it?
spent, I'm gonna say hundreds,
Even if
plural, of
even if they
thousands
gave
of
you the
dollars to
house,
rebuild the house.
Yeah.
Did they find the staircase?
It's what?
Did they find the staircase?
Oh yeah.
They
When
found the
Norma got
staircase.
in, when Norma got in and started to renovate the house, the staircase had been encased in plywood.
Oh my.
Ah.
And it was not, and when you walk, and I've not been in the house, but of what I understand, you walk in the house and all of a sudden the staircase just goes up.
Wow.
When you walked in the house, there's apartments, you walked into a solid wall. And you couldn't even see it. But when they started pulling the plywood off, she said, and I met her, she, at some kind of event, and she introduced herself. I'd heard the name, I just didn't know her. Her husband passed away a few years ago, and she built that little carriage type house as a craft house because she was into crafts and antiques and stuff. And she put the house on the market 2 years ago, and she had it up about, I'm guessing $700,000 or $800,000, and it sat here for a while. And I don't know, it ended up selling last year, but I don't know how much it was. But whatever, they did the city a great favor by saving this house and putting it back. And this may be close to what it looked like originally. You know, it's not any gaudy colors, you know, but it's beautiful. And we're very thankful that the Trapps decided to save this house.
Is that a widow's walk up top?
That's what it is. It is.
I never heard of that.
Is this one empty now?
I have to stop here because this is a historic house, and unfortunately, y'all see that it's undergoing some rapid deterioration, and I'll tell you about that. But this house is known as the Thurman house. This guy that moved here from Mississippi was in the building material business, very prominent businessman, and got established. His name was R.J. Thurman, and he did very well. In fact, he was a mayor. There's another mayor who lived in Montgomery, but actually I'm not sure if I got this date or not. 3 terms as mayor, 3 terms as mayor, and got sick in 1908 and died while he was the mayor at age 41. Just, you know, how health care, I'm not sure Dr. Blair could save him, you know. But Mr. Thurman was very well liked in the city. And then the house went on the market, and here's a name that you don't hear a lot, but the name of Colagross. Colagross. Colagross bought the house. And in doing research in Sheffield, the name Colagross dates back to 1885. They were 2 or 3 brothers were first firemen in Sheffield. And one of them ended up buying this house in '08 after Mr. Thurman passed away. And in fact, there was a guy that went to school with me that grew up in this house because the man that bought the house would have been his grandfather. And so Colagross' family lived in this house, I'm going to say, for the next 65, 70 years. And this is beyond me. I don't understand this. The family moved out of the house. One of the parents passed away. The boy that was my age had already established his family in another part of the county. This is another house that sat vacant. And it sat from the 80s until, I'm going to say, late 90s. And in the late 90s, a man who had bought a house, and you can't see it just through the trees, and when we go down to here where you can, it's the big castle-looking house over there. He was looking through the trees in the wintertime and seeing this vacant house, and so he came over and bought the house. And he was, because it had sat vacant for so long, he himself was doing some work up on the roof, and he fell off the roof. And it didn't kill him, but it killed his desire to do anything else to the house. And so in the early 2000s, he sold the house to a developer. And I don't know the person's name, but from what I understand, the person was in that aspect of fixing and flipping.
Yep.
And they fixed it to appeal to the eye, but you see what they did. They didn't fix it properly. And we met the lady on a tour 2 years ago, had just bought the house, and she apologized to us then for the way it looked, and she says, I'm gonna put it back right. But she lived by herself as a single lady, and I'm not sure she had the pockets, deep pockets to do it, and so has not had anything done in the last 2 years, and she's lived here. And so it's been deteriorating over the last 20 years, even though initially it looked wonderful. I mean, I used to ride my bike up and down through here when it was sitting on the market with a for sale sign, and the kitchen looked wonderful, all this granite stuff. And it was just really nice and shiny looking, and then over the years it looked livable, and it sat vacant for sale until somebody bought it, and then they realized they had to prop the porch up, and then they had to do something else, and that guy lived here about 5 years, and he said, it's not worth it, I'm gonna move. And then this lady bought it, and unfortunately they fixed it, but they fixed it with inferior product. And that's a sad story to me, you know.